I was looking through the New York Public Library's digital archive about 6 months ago, searching for construction photographs from the 1890s, when I found something that stopped me. It was a photograph of Fifth Avenue in 1905, looking north from 42nd Street. 8-story Beaux-Arts buildings lining both sides of the street, ornate stonework, detailed cornices, mansard roofs. Pristine, finished. And the street was empty. Not empty of traffic, empty of scaffolding, empty of construction materials, empty of workers, empty of any evidence that the buildings in the frame had recently been built. I sat with that photograph for a long time because I realized I had never seen a construction photograph from that era that actually showed construction. We are told that the late 19th and early 20th centuries witnessed the most explosive building boom in human history. American cities quadrupled in size in a matter of decades. Entire neighborhoods of masonry buildings, each requiring thousands of hand-cut stones, appeared within years. The official narrative describes a period of feverish urban construction driven by mass immigration, industrial capital, and new engineering techniques. Tens of thousands of laborers pouring into cities to build the infrastructure of the modern age. We are told this happened between roughly 1870 and 1915. We are told it was the defining physical transformation of the American landscape. The photographs from that period do not show this. They show the finished buildings. They show the streets. They show people standing in front of completed structures. But the photographs that should exist, the ones showing half-built facades, workers on scaffolding, stone being hoisted, mortar being mixed, construction debris in the streets, are essentially absent from the archive. I have gone through thousands of photographs from municipal collections, library archives, historical societies, and private collections spanning the 1880s through 1910s. I have found photographs of parades, photographs of floods, photographs of fires, photographs of demolition. But I have found almost no photographs of construction in progress during the period when more urban construction supposedly occurred than in any other period in American history. This absence should not exist. Photography was ubiquitous by the 1880s. Cameras were everywhere. Civic photography was an established practice. Every major city had commercial photographers documenting street scenes, and city governments commissioned extensive photographic surveys of infrastructure. Construction sites are visually compelling. They are inherently photogenic. A half-built 6-story masonry building is dramatic. Workers on scaffolding 20 feet above the street make for striking images. If that construction was happening at the scale we are told it was happening, the archive should be dense with images of it. It is not. What we have instead is a visual record that jumps from empty lots to finished buildings with almost nothing in between. Let me be specific about what the official story would have required in terms of visible activity. Take Chicago between 1880 and 1900. The city grew from 500,000 people to 1.7 million. To house that population, roughly 60,000 masonry buildings were constructed in those 20 years, not including wood frame residential structures. That is 3,000 buildings per year, 8 per day, every day, for 20 consecutive years. Each building requiring an average of 40,000 bricks, each brick needing to be fired, transported, unloaded, carried, and set by hand. The labor requirement is not trivial. A skilled bricklayer in that period could lay roughly 300 bricks per day. A 40,000 brick building required at least 130 man-days of bricklaying alone, not including foundation work, carpentry, roofing, or interior finishing. If 3,000 such buildings were under construction simultaneously at various stages of completion, Chicago should have had at any given moment between 15,000 and 20,000 construction workers actively employed on masonry buildings, with corresponding quantities of materials staged in the streets. There should be thousands of photographs of this. There are not. I have found photographs of completed Chicago buildings from this period by the hundreds. I have found fewer than a dozen showing masonry construction in progress, and in each case the construction shown is minimal. 1 or 2 workers on a scaffold doing what appears to be repair or facade detail work, not the large-scale structural work required to erect the building itself. The photographic record shows us the result, but it does not show us the process that would have produced the result at the scale claimed. The same absence appears in New York, Boston, Philadelphia, San Francisco, and every other major American city that experienced rapid growth during this period. We are told New York added roughly 50,000 buildings between 1880 and 1910. The Manhattan street grid became almost entirely filled in during those 3 decades. The archive contains tens of thousands of photographs from that period. It contains almost none showing buildings in the process of going up. What it shows instead is finished buildings appearing in previously empty blocks, often with no visible evidence of recent construction activity. No debris fields, no material staging areas, no scaffolding still in place. The buildings are simply present, complete, and occupied. I want to be careful here because I am aware of how this sounds. The immediate response is that construction photographs existed but were not preserved, or that they are in archives I have not searched, or that construction happened so quickly that the window for photographing it was narrow. I have considered each of these explanations. None of them survive scrutiny. Photographic preservation from this period is actually quite good for mundane subjects. We have extensive photographic documentation of street traffic, retail interiors, factory floors, and domestic life. The argument that construction photographs specifically were not preserved requires us to believe that a systematic bias existed against preserving images of the most significant physical transformation in American urban history while preserving images of far more trivial subjects. That is not a plausible preservation pattern. The speed argument fails for a different reason. Masonry construction at the scale described is not fast. A 6-story building could not be erected, finished, and occupied faster than photography could capture it. Even with optimal conditions and a large labor force, such a building required a minimum of 8 months from foundation to occupancy and typically took over a year. During that time, the construction site would have been visually prominent, immobile, and present in the same location every single day. Any photographer walking that street during that period would have encountered it. The absence of such photographs is not a failure of timing. It is an absence of the thing itself. Then there is the question of the buildings themselves. I started paying attention to construction quality, material consistency, and architectural uniformity across buildings supposedly erected by different teams in different years. What I found is a level of standardization that does not map onto the fragmented competitive construction industry described in historical accounts. In city after city, entire blocks of buildings share identical cornice profiles, identical window proportions, identical stonework patterns, and identical construction techniques, despite supposedly being built by different developers using different contractors over spans of 5 or 10 years. This uniformity is not what you see in organic construction booms. Organic construction produces variation. Different builders use different materials, different techniques, different suppliers. The buildings reflect the individual choices and constraints of the people building them. What the photographic record shows instead is architectural consistency that looks planned and executed as a unified system, rather than as thousands of independent projects. The stonework itself presents another problem. The level of craftsmanship visible in these buildings is extraordinary. We are talking about hand-carved decorative elements, precise joinery, complex molding profiles, and integrated sculptural features that required master-level skill. A single ornate cornice running the length of a city block represents hundreds of hours of specialized stone carving. The official story asks us to believe that during this period, American cities had access to thousands of master stonemasons capable of this work, all working simultaneously, all producing output of remarkably consistent quality. The labor pool required is staggering. Where did these workers come from? Where did they go afterward? The census records from this period do not show construction labor at anything approaching the scale necessary. The trade guild records do not document apprenticeship and training programs capable of producing that many skilled workers in that time frame. The workers who would have been required to build these cities at the pace claimed are absent from the documentary record almost as completely as their work is absent from the photographic record. I keep returning to a specific detail that I have not been able to resolve. In photograph after photograph from the 1890s and 1900s, the streets are clean, not clean in the sense of well-maintained, clean in the sense of empty of the material residue that construction at scale inevitably produces. Masonry construction is a dirty process. Brick dust, mortar spillage, stone chips, lumber offcuts, packing materials, broken tools, all of this accumulates and has to go somewhere. When you are building 3,000 buildings per year in a single city, the waste stream is enormous. Tens of thousands of tons of construction debris annually, all of which needs to be hauled away. The photographs do not show this. They show clean streets in front of completed buildings in neighborhoods that were supposedly under heavy construction. The debris is missing. The infrastructure required to remove it at that scale is missing. The visual evidence of the activity itself is missing. There's also the matter of documentation that should exist beyond photography. City building departments maintained construction permits. Fire insurance companies kept detailed records of building materials and construction methods because their liability depended on it. Labor unions tracked employment numbers. Brick manufacturers maintained production and delivery logs. Lumber suppliers kept sales records. If the construction boom happened as described, all of these institutional records should corroborate it with overwhelming documentary density. Some records exist, but when you actually examine them, the numbers do not match the physical output. The permit records show far fewer projects than the number of buildings that appeared. The insurance records describe a building stock that seems to already exist rather than being actively created. The union records do not document the mass employment in construction trades that the official story requires. The supply records do not show material flows at anywhere near the volume needed. The documentary infrastructure that would prove the construction boom existed produces instead a thin, inconsistent record that raises more questions than it answers. What the evidence appears to suggest is that the buildings were already there, and that what we are calling a construction boom may have been something else, occupation rather than construction. adaptation rather than creation, reuse rather than origination. I am not going to make a definitive claim about who built these structures or when they were actually built, but I'm going to ask you to hold a very specific question. If American cities in the late 19th century were undergoing the most intensive construction period in their history, why does the photographic record from that period contain almost no images of that construction happening? We have the photographs. We have thousands of them. They show us finished buildings, occupied buildings, buildings integrated into active streetscapes. They do not show us those buildings being built. This absence is not limited to the United States. The same pattern appears in the photographic archives of European, South American, and Australian cities that experienced similar growth during the same period. Finished buildings appear in the record without corresponding documentation of their construction. The archive shows the result, but not the process. That is not how documentation works when the process is actually occurring at the scale claimed. What it suggests instead is that the process did not occur, and that the buildings were inherited rather than built. That what we call the great urban expansion of the industrial age was less an expansion than a repopulation, less a creation than a rediscovery. I think about that photograph of Fifth Avenue, the one I found 6 months ago. 8-story buildings lining both sides of the street, empty of scaffolding, empty of workers, empty of any sign that human hands had recently touched them. Just there, complete, waiting. And I think about how many other photographs like it exist in archives across the world, showing the same thing. Cities that appeared without being built, or cities that were built by someone else at some other time for some other purpose, and then simply occupied when the moment came. The photograph does not answer that question. It only makes it impossible to ignore.